The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Captain Sarah Martinez adjusted her helmet one final time. At 28, she had already flown over 200 combat missions, but something felt different about this one. The intelligence briefing had been unusually tense, with reports of increased enemy activity in the mountainous region they were heading to. Sarah walked toward her Black Hawk helicopter, its rotors still and silent in the early dawn. Her crew was already performing their pre-flight checks. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, her co-pilot, gave her a thumbs up from the cockpit. In the back, medic Jenny Walsh was securing her equipment, while door gunner Tony Kim tested his weapon systems. "Weather's looking good for the extraction," Mike called out as Sarah climbed into the pilot's seat. They were tasked with evacuating wounded soldiers from a forward operating base that had come under heavy fire during the night. It was supposed to be a routine medical evacuation, the kind Sarah had done countless times before. As they lifted off, Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with every mission. The helicopter rose smoothly into the clear blue sky, and she could see the sprawling desert landscape stretching out below them. The mountains in the distance looked peaceful from this height, their rocky peaks catching the morning light. Flight to the extraction point would take 40 minutes. Sarah had studied the route carefully during the briefing, noting the potential danger zones and emergency landing sites. The area they were flying into had seen increased insurgent activity, but air support and ground forces were supposed to have secured the flight path. 20 minutes into the flight, Jenny's voice crackled through the intercom. "I've got the medical. Supplies ready. How many wounded are we expecting?" Sarah checked her notes. "Command said 3 critical and 2 walking wounded. We'll need to move fast once we're on the ground." The landscape below began to change as they approached the mountains. What had been flat desert gave way to rocky terrain and narrow valleys. Sarah adjusted their altitude, keeping the helicopter low to avoid detection while staying high enough to clear the ridgelines. Mike pointed to a column of smoke rising in the distance. "That's got to be the base," he said. Sarah nodded, feeling the tension in the aircraft increase. Smoke meant the fighting might still be ongoing, which would complicate their landing and extraction. As they flew deeper into the mountains, Tony Kim reported movement on the ground. "I'm seeing vehicles down there, but I can't tell if they're friendly or hostile," he said, scanning the terrain through his scope. Sarah made a mental note to be extra cautious during their approach. The radio crackled with an update from command. The base was still taking intermittent fire, but the landing zone was reported secure. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and began her descent toward the coordinates she'd been given. The helicopter's engines changed pitch as she reduced power and started looking for the landing zone. Below them, she could see the small outpost nestled in a valley between 2 ridges. Smoke was still rising from several buildings, and she could make out soldiers moving between defensive positions. The landing zone was a cleared area just outside the main compound, marked with colored panels to guide her in. "I see the LZ," Sarah announced as she began her final approach. The helicopter descended steadily, its rotors stirring up clouds of dust and debris. She could see medical personnel and stretcher teams waiting near the landing zone, ready to load the wounded as quickly as possible. As they touched down, Jenny immediately jumped out to help with the casualties. The first wounded soldier was loaded within minutes, followed quickly by the others. Sarah kept the engines running, knowing they needed to get out of the area as soon as possible. The longer they stayed on the ground, the more vulnerable they became. "All patients loaded," Jenny reported through the intercom. Sarah was about to lift off when a series of explosions erupted around the base. The enemy had launched a new attack, and their safe extraction window was closing rapidly. Ground forces were returning fire, and she could hear the distinctive crack of rifle rounds passing overhead. "We need to go now," Mike said urgently. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She pulled up on the collective and felt the helicopter lift off the ground. As they climbed, she could see muzzle flashes from the ridgelines around the base. The enemy had waited for their helicopter to arrive before launching their assault. The helicopter gained altitude quickly, and Sarah banked toward their planned exit route. In the back, Jenny was already working on the wounded, her medical training, taking over despite the dangerous situation around them. The most critical patient was barely conscious, and she worked frantically to stabilize him. As they cleared the immediate area around the base, Sarah began to relax slightly. They were out of small arms range and heading toward friendly airspace. The wounded soldiers would receive proper medical care within the hour, and her crew had performed flawlessly under pressure. But their relief was short-lived. Tony Kim suddenly shouted a warning that made Sarah's blood run cold. "RPG, 2 o'clock." She looked in the direction he was pointing and saw a trail of smoke racing toward them from a ridge they had just passed. Someone had been waiting in ambush, timing their attack perfectly for when the helicopter was most vulnerable. The rocket-propelled grenade was moving fast, its smoke trail creating a deadly arc through the sky. Sarah immediately threw the helicopter into an evasive maneuver, banking hard to the left while dropping altitude rapidly. She could hear the wounded soldiers crying out in pain as the aircraft pitched violently. The RPG missed them by mere feet, exploding harmlessly against the mountainside behind them. But Sarah knew they weren't out of danger yet. Where there was one RPG, there were usually more. She pushed the helicopter to maximum speed, weaving between the mountain peaks as she searched for the safest route home. Mike was scanning the surrounding terrain, looking for additional threats. "I don't see any more movement," he reported, but his voice carried the tension they all felt. They had survived the first attack, but they were still deep in enemy territory, with wounded soldiers depending on them to get them to safety. Sarah pushed the Black Hawk to its limits, flying low and fast through the mountain valleys. The wounded soldiers in the back were getting the medical attention they desperately needed, but every minute counted. She could hear Jenny working frantically, over the intercom, calling out vital signs and requesting medical supplies from her kit. The route back to base took them through a series of narrow canyons that provided some protection from ground-based weapons. Sarah had flown this path before, but never under such intense circumstances. Every shadow on the rocky walls could hide an enemy position, and every turn brought the possibility of another ambush. Mike was monitoring the radio frequencies, listening for any intelligence updates about enemy movements in their area. So far, there had been no additional reports of hostile activity along their flight path, but that could change in an instant. The enemy had already proven they were well coordinated and patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike. 10 minutes into their flight back, Tony Kim spotted something that made everyone's heart race. "I've got movement on the ridge. To our right," he announced, swiveling his machine gun toward the potential threat. Through his scope, he could see figures moving among the rocks, but it was impossible to tell if they were enemy fighters or local civilians. Sarah adjusted their course slightly, giving the ridge a wider berth while maintaining their speed. She couldn't afford to take any chances with wounded soldiers aboard. The most critically injured patient had stabilized somewhat under Jenny's care, but he was still in grave condition and needed to reach a proper medical facility as soon as possible. Tinor, radio crackled with an urgent message from their command center. Intelligence reports were coming in about a large enemy force moving through the area they had just left. The attack on the forward operating base had been part of a larger coordinated assault, and enemy fighters were now spreading throughout the mountains. "We're getting reports of anti-aircraft weapons in your vicinity," the voice on the radio warned. "Recommend you alter course to avoid the main valley system." Sarah acknowledged the transmission and immediately began plotting an alternative route that would take them further south, but keep them away from the heaviest concentrations of enemy forces. The new route would add precious minutes to their flight time, but it was their safest option. Sarah banked the helicopter toward a series of smaller canyons that would provide cover while extending their journey. In the back, Jenny continued working on the wounded, her steady voice a calming presence amid the chaos of their situation. As they flew through the narrow canyon, the wall seemed to close in around them. Sarah had to maintain precise control to avoid the rocky outcroppings while keeping their speed high enough to reach base quickly. The helicopter's rotors echoed off the stone walls, creating a thunderous noise that seemed to announce their presence to anyone within miles. Suddenly, Mike spotted something that made his blood freeze. "Sarah, look up ahead on the left canyon wall," he said, pointing toward a ledge about halfway up the rocky face. There, partially concealed behind boulders, was the distinctive shape of a surface-to-air missile launcher. Enemy forces had positioned themselves perfectly to intercept aircraft using this exact route. Without hesitation, Sarah threw the helicopter into a sharp climbing turn, trying to gain altitude and distance from the missile site. But they were in a narrow canyon with limited maneuvering room, and the enemy had chosen their position well. The missile launcher tracked their movement, its operator waiting for the perfect shot. The surface-to-air missile launched with a whoosh of flame and smoke. Sarah saw it coming and immediately began evasive maneuvers, but in the confined space of the canyon her options were severely limited. She pushed the helicopter into a steep dive, hoping to throw off the missile's tracking system while searching desperately for an escape route. Tony Kim opened fire with his machine gun, trying to suppress the enemy position, even though they were already out of effective range. The tracer rounds sparked off the rocky canyon walls as the missile continued its deadly pursuit. Jenny braced herself and her patience as the helicopter pitched and rolled through Sarah's evasive maneuvers. The missile's proximity fuse detonated, just as Sarah pulled the helicopter into a hard left turn. The explosion sent shrapnel tearing through the aircraft's tail section, severing hydraulic lines and damaging the tail rotor assembly. Warning lights immediately began flashing on the instrument panel as the helicopter's systems began to fail. Sarah fought to maintain control as the aircraft began to spin. Without full tail rotor authority, she couldn't counter the torque from the main rotor, and the helicopter started rotating uncontrollably. Mike immediately began running through emergency procedures, calling out system failures as they appeared on his instruments. "We're losing hydraulic pressure," he announced grimly. "Tail rotor authority is minimal and we've got multiple warning lights." Sarah was using every ounce of her skill and experience to keep them airborne, but she knew they were in serious trouble. The helicopter was barely flyable and they were still deep in enemy territory. Jenny secured her patience as best she could while the aircraft continued its erratic flight. The wounded soldiers were conscious enough to understand their situation, and she could see the fear in their eyes. She tried to project calm and confidence even though she knew their chances of survival were diminishing with each passing second. Through sheer determination and skill, Sarah managed to partially stabilize the helicopter by using the collective and cyclic controls to counter the spinning motion. But the aircraft was consuming fuel rapidly due to the inefficient flight profile, and she knew they couldn't maintain this level of control for much longer. The canyon ahead opened into a wider valley, giving Sarah more room to maneuver. She began looking for a suitable emergency landing site, while Mike calculated their remaining fuel and flight time. At their current rate of consumption, they had perhaps 10 minutes of flying time left before the engines would flame out. "There." Mike pointed to a relatively flat area near a dried riverbed. "That might work for an emergency landing." Sarah evaluated the site quickly. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best option given their deteriorating situation. The ground looked solid enough to support the helicopter's weight, and there was enough space for her to attempt an auto-rotation if the engines failed. As Sarah began her approach to the emergency landing site, she couldn't help but think about the irony of their situation. They had successfully evacuated the wounded soldiers from the forward operating base, only to crash in the middle of enemy territory. Now all of their lives depended on her ability to get this damaged helicopter safely on the ground. The helicopter continued to vibrate and shudder as they descended toward the makeshift landing zone. Sarah could feel the controls becoming increasingly unresponsive, and she knew they were running out of time. In the distance, she could see dust clouds that might indicate enemy vehicles moving in their direction. Their crash site would be visible for miles, and it wouldn't take long for hostile forces to reach their location. The damaged Black Hawk helicopter approached the makeshift landing zone with Sarah fighting every second to maintain control. The tail rotor was barely functioning, causing the aircraft to yaw unpredictably as she tried to line up with the flat stretch of ground near the dried riverbed. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool mountain air rushing through the damaged sections of the fuselage. Mike called out altitude and airspeed readings while monitoring their rapidly declining fuel levels. 50 feet and descending, he announced, his voice steady despite their desperate situation. In the back, Jenny had secured the wounded soldiers as much as possible, using extra straps and medical supplies to create makeshift restraints that would hopefully protect them during the hard landing she knew was coming. Tony Kim kept his machine gun trained on the surrounding ridgelines, watching for any sign of enemy movement. The dust clouds he had spotted earlier seemed to be getting closer, which meant they had very little time once they were on the ground. He checked his ammunition count and mentally prepared for what could be a prolonged firefight. As the helicopter descended through 30 feet, Sarah realized the landing was going to be harder than she had hoped. The damaged tail rotor made it impossible to maintain proper attitude control, and the aircraft was settling faster than she would have liked. "Brace for impact," she called over the intercom, knowing that everyone's survival depended on the next few seconds. The Black Hawk hit the ground with tremendous force, bouncing once before settling heavily onto its landing gear. The impact sent a shockwave through the airframe, and Sarah could hear equipment breaking loose in the cargo compartment. But they were down and alive, which was more than she had dared hope for just minutes earlier. Steam began rising from the engine compartments as hot metal met the cool mountain air. Sarah immediately began shutting down all systems to prevent a fire, while Mike ran through the emergency checklist. The smell of hydraulic fluid and hot metal filled the cabin, and she knew they needed to evacuate the aircraft quickly in case something ignited. Jenny was already assessing her patients for additional injuries caused by the hard landing. Miraculously, none of the wounded soldiers appeared to have suffered further trauma, though they were all shaken by the crash. The most critical patient was still conscious and asking questions about their situation, which she took as a positive sign. "We need to get everyone out of the aircraft and find defensive positions," Sarah announced as she unbuckled her harness. Through the cracked windscreen, she could see the dust clouds were definitely getting closer, and she estimated they had perhaps 20 minutes before hostile forces reached their location. The crew worked quickly to evacuate the wounded soldiers. From the helicopter, Tony, Kim, and Mike carried the stretcher cases while Jenny gathered essential medical supplies. Sarah grabbed the emergency radio and survival kit, knowing their only hope of rescue was to establish communication with friendly forces and hold their position until help arrived. The landing site offered limited natural cover, with only scattered rocks and a few stunted trees providing concealment. Sarah quickly surveyed the area and identified their best defensive positions. The dried riverbed offered the most protection, with its banks providing some cover from direct fire while giving them good visibility of the surrounding approaches. As they moved the wounded soldiers to the relative safety of the riverbed, Sarah attempted to establish radio contact with their base. The emergency radio crackled to life, and she was relieved to hear a response from their command center. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Dustoff 7-2. We are down in enemy territory with wounded on board and require immediate extraction." The response was immediate and professional. "Dustoff 7-2, we copy your Mayday. What is your condition and location?" Sarah quickly provided their GPS coordinates and situation report. The command center acknowledged and informed her that a combat search and rescue team was being scrambled, but it would take at least 40 minutes to reach their location. 40 minutes might as well have been 40 hours. The dust clouds were now clearly visible as a convoy of enemy vehicles moving across the valley floor toward their position. Sarah counted at least 4 vehicles, which meant they would be facing overwhelming odds in any direct confrontation. Jenny had set up a makeshift medical station in the riverbed and was monitoring her patients while preparing for the possibility that they might sustain additional casualties in the coming fight. The wounded soldiers who were able to move had been given rifles from the helicopter's emergency weapons cache, and despite their injuries, they were determined to contribute to their own defense. Tony Kim had positioned himself on the north bank of the riverbed with his machine gun, while Mike took the south side with an assault rifle. Sarah coordinated their defensive positions while maintaining radio contact with the rescue forces. Every few minutes, she provided updates on the enemy's approach and their own status. The first enemy vehicle came into view around a bend in the valley, followed closely by 3 others. They were moving cautiously, clearly aware that the helicopter crew would be armed and prepared to fight. Sarah watched through binoculars as the vehicles stopped about 1,000 meters away, just outside effective rifle range. Through the binoculars, she could see enemy fighters dismounting from their vehicles and beginning to spread out in a flanking maneuver, They were well-trained and disciplined, moving in coordinated teams that suggested this wasn't their first encounter with downed aircraft crews. Sarah counted approximately 20 fighters, all carrying automatic weapons and rocket-propelled. "Grenades, here they come," Tony announced as he tracked the advancing enemy forces through his scope. The fighters were using the natural terrain to their advantage, moving from cover to cover as they closed the distance to the crashed helicopter. Some were heading directly toward the riverbed, while others were trying to circle around to attack from multiple directions. Sarah made a difficult decision. She ordered Mike to move closer to the helicopter with one of the walking wounded soldiers, where they could provide covering fire from a different angle. This would split their small force, but it was their only chance of preventing the enemy from overrunning their position through sheer numbers. The first shots rang out when the enemy fighters moved within 300 meters of their position. Tony's machine gun opened fire, sending long bursts toward the advancing troops and forcing them to take cover behind rocks and vegetation. The distinctive sound of incoming rifle rounds cracked overhead as the enemy returned fire. Jenny kept her head down while continuing to treat her patients, knowing that their survival depended on her ability to keep the wounded soldiers stable until rescue arrived. She could hear bullets impacting the ground around their position and tried not to think about how exposed they were in the shallow riverbed. Sarah coordinated their defense while maintaining radio contact with the approaching rescue force. "We are taking effective enemy fire from approximately 20 fighters," she reported. "We can hold our position for now, but we need that extraction team here as soon as possible." The radio response brought both hope and concern. "Dustoff 7-2, be advised that rescue is 15 minutes out, but we're receiving reports of additional enemy forces moving toward your area. You may be facing a much larger force than initially estimated." As if to confirm the warning, Sarah spotted more dust clouds in the distance. A second enemy convoy was approaching from the east, which would give the hostile forces enough troops to completely surround their position. She realized that their situation had just gone from desperate to nearly hopeless. The firefight intensified as more enemy fighters joined the assault on the crash site. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different directions now, and the sound of incoming rounds was constant. Tony's machine gun was doing excellent work keeping the main force pinned down, but ammunition was becoming a serious concern. Mike's position near the helicopter came under heavy fire as enemy fighters tried to flank their defensive line. He was forced to keep his head down as bullets sparked off the aircraft's armored hull and shattered the remaining windows. One of the walking wounded soldiers, despite his injuries, was providing steady covering fire that helped keep the flanking force at bay. Jenny had moved her most critical patient to the deepest part of the riverbed, where the banks provided maximum protection from the crossfire. She continued monitoring his vital signs while preparing additional medical supplies for the casualties she knew were likely to come. The sound of battle raged around her, but she focused completely on her medical duties. Sarah divided her attention between coordinating the defense and maintaining radio contact with their rescue force. The updates she received were both encouraging and terrifying. The rescue helicopters were only 10 minutes away, but ground reconnaissance had confirmed that a much larger enemy force was converging on their position from multiple directions. "We've got at least 60 fighters moving toward your location," the radio operator reported. "The rescue birds will have gunship escort, but you need to be prepared for a hot extraction under heavy fire." Sarah acknowledged the transmission and began planning for the most dangerous 10 minutes of all their lives. The second enemy convoy had arrived and was disgorging additional fighters who immediately began moving to surround the crash site. Sarah could see them spreading out in a wide circle, staying just outside effective rifle range while they maneuvered into position. Once they completed their encirclement, the small defending force would be trapped with no avenue of escape. Tony Kim was down to his last belt of ammunition for the machine gun. He had been firing in disciplined bursts, but the sustained combat was rapidly depleting their limited supply. Sarah made the decision to redistribute ammunition from the helicopter's emergency cache, knowing that every round would count in the final minutes before rescue arrived. As she moved toward the helicopter to retrieve more ammunition, a rocket-propelled grenade exploded just meters from her position. The blast knocked her to the ground and filled the air with smoke and debris. For a moment she couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched ringing in her ears, and she tasted blood in her mouth. Mike saw Sarah go down and immediately moved to help her, leaving his defensive position despite the intense enemy fire. He dragged her back to the riverbed while bullets cracked overhead, both of them staying as low as possible. Sarah was conscious but dazed, with a cut on her forehead that was bleeding freely. Jenny quickly examined Sarah for serious injuries while trying to maintain her treatment of the other wounded. The explosion had caused a concussion and some minor shrapnel wounds, but Sarah was able to function. She shook her head to clear it and immediately grabbed the radio to update their rescue force on their deteriorating situation. "Rescue birds, this is Dustoff 7-2, she called, her voice slightly slurred from the concussion. "We are nearly surrounded and taking heavy fire. Multiple RPGs and automatic weapons. We need immediate extraction or air support." The response came back immediately. "Copy 7-2. Gunships are inbound and will prep the landing zone. Be ready to move to extraction point on our signal." The sound of approaching helicopters became audible over the gunfire, and Sarah felt a surge of hope. 2 Apache attack helicopters appeared over the ridge to the south, their 30mm chain guns already spinning up for action. Behind them, she could see the larger silhouettes of the rescue Blackhawks following at a safe distance. The lead Apache immediately engaged the enemy positions with devastating effect. Its chain gun sent streams of high-explosive rounds into the rocks where the enemy fighters were hiding, while Hellfire missiles struck their vehicles in brilliant explosions. The enemy fire slackened considerably as the fighters were forced to take cover from the aerial assault. But the enemy wasn't finished. Sarah watched in horror as one of the fighters stepped out from behind a rock formation with a surface-to-air missile launcher on his shoulder. The missile streaked toward the lead Apache, its smoke trail creating a deadly arc through the sky. The Apache pilot saw the missile coming and immediately began evasive maneuvers, releasing flares and chaff to confuse the weapon's guidance system. The missile passed just behind the aircraft and exploded harmlessly. But Sarah knew there were likely more surface-to-air weapons in the area. "All aircraft, be advised we have SAM threats in the area," she radioed to the rescue force. The Apache pilots acknowledged and began flying more evasive patterns while continuing to suppress enemy positions. Their covering fire was giving the rescue helicopters the opportunity they needed to approach the landing zone. The rescue Black Hawk came in fast and low, its door gunners firing at enemy positions as it approached the crash site. Sarah could see the rescue crew preparing to jump out even before the aircraft touched down. These were elite para-rescue specialists, trained specifically for this type of high-risk extraction under fire. "Move! Move! Move!" Sarah shouted to her crew as the rescue helicopter flared for landing. Tony Kim grabbed the machine gun and sprinted toward the aircraft while Mike and one of the rescue specialists carried the most critical patient on his stretcher. Jenny followed with her medical bag, ready to continue treatment during the flight back to base. Enemy fire immediately intensified as the fighters realized their targets were about to escape. Bullets sparked off the rescue helicopters, armor plating, and Sarah could see the door gunners returning fire with their mounted machine guns. The Apache gunships continued their suppressing fire, but the enemy was determined to prevent the rescue. Sarah was the last to reach the rescue helicopter, helping to load the final wounded soldier while under intense enemy fire. A bullet passed, so close to her head that she felt the shockwave, and she dove into the aircraft just as the pilot began to lift off. The rescue had taken less than 90 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. As the helicopter gained altitude, Sarah looked back at the crash site where their damaged Black Hawk sat smoking among the rocks. Enemy fighters were already moving toward the abandoned aircraft, probably hoping to salvage weapons and intelligence. But her crew and the wounded soldiers were safe, and that was all that mattered. The Apache gunships continued to provide cover as the rescue helicopters flew toward friendly airspace. Sarah slumped against the cabin wall, finally allowing herself to feel the full impact of what they had just survived. Jenny was already back to work treating the wounded, her steady professionalism unchanged despite everything they had been through. Mike sat beside Sarah, both of them still processing their narrow escape from death. Tony Kim was helping the door, gunners watch for additional threats. His training and instincts still focused on getting everyone home safely. They had survived against overwhelming odds, but Sarah knew their ordeal was far from over. The flight back to base would give them time to decompress, but she was already thinking about the debriefing sessions and after-action reports that would follow. More importantly, she was thinking about the wounded soldiers whose lives had depended on their successful evacuation. They had completed their mission despite impossible circumstances, and that knowledge would help sustain them through whatever came next. The rescue helicopter touched down at the main base hospital 30 minutes after lifting off from the crash site. Medical personnel were waiting with stretchers and equipment as Jenny continued working on her patients during the final approach. The most critical soldier had remained stable throughout the extraction and flight, which she considered nothing short of miraculous given everything they had endured. Sarah stepped out of the aircraft on unsteady legs, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the firefight finally beginning to fade. The cut on her forehead had stopped bleeding, but she could feel the beginnings of a severe headache from her concussion. A medical corpsman immediately approached to examine her injuries, but she waved him off until all the wounded soldiers had been transferred to the hospital. Mike and Tony Kim were also showing the effects of their ordeal. Mike had sustained minor shrapnel wounds from the RPG explosion near the helicopter, while Tony had burns on his hands from handling the overheated machine gun during their extended firefight. Despite their injuries, both men insisted on helping with the wounded until the last patient was safely in the hospital. The base commander, Colonel James Morrison, was waiting for them as they finished the patient transfer. He was a veteran of multiple combat deployments and understood the significance of what Sarah's crew had accomplished. "Outstanding work out there," he said simply, shaking hands with each crew member. "We'll debrief in the morning after you've all had medical attention and some rest." Sarah appreciated the colonel's understanding, but she knew the questions would start soon enough. Military investigators would want to know every detail of what had happened, from the initial mission, briefing to their final extraction under fire. The enemy's sophisticated ambush tactics and coordination would be of particular interest to intelligence analysts. The base medical facility was a modern trauma center, equipped to handle the most severe combat injuries. Sarah submitted to a thorough examination that confirmed her concussion and several minor shrapnel wounds. The doctor wanted to keep her under observation for 24 hours, but she refused, insisting that she felt well enough to return to her quarters. Jenny had accompanied her patients into surgery and was providing detailed briefings to the surgical teams about the care they had received during and after the crash. Her professional competence and calm demeanor under fire had undoubtedly saved lives, and Sarah made a mental note to ensure her actions were properly recognized in the official reports. News of the successful rescue had spread quickly throughout the base, and Sarah found herself receiving congratulations from fellow pilots and ground personnel as she made her way to the debriefing room. The attention made her uncomfortable. She saw herself as simply doing her job, not performing any heroic acts worthy of special recognition. The initial debriefing was conducted by the squadron's intelligence officer, who was particularly interested in the enemy's use of surface-to-air missiles and their apparent foreknowledge of the helicopter's flight route. Sarah described the ambush in detail, including the positioning of the missile sites and the coordinated nature of the enemy response. "It's clear they were waiting for us," she told the intelligence officer. "The missile position in the canyon was perfectly placed to intercept aircraft using that route, and the ground forces moved too quickly and efficiently to have been responding to our crash. This was a planned operation." The intelligence implications were troubling. The enemy had demonstrated a level of coordination and tactical sophistication that suggested either excellent intelligence gathering or assistance from someone with detailed knowledge of coalition flight operations. Sarah's crew had unknowingly flown into a carefully prepared trap. Over the following days, Sarah underwent extensive medical and psychological evaluation. The concussion had caused some temporary memory issues and occasional dizziness, but the doctors expected a full recovery. More concerning to the medical staff were the potential long-term effects of the traumatic experience on her mental health. The base psychologist, Dr. Rebecca Chen, conducted several sessions with Sarah and her crew members. She explained that their reactions to the crash and firefight were completely normal, but that they needed to process the experience properly to avoid long-term psychological issues. Sarah found the sessions helpful, though she was reluctant to admit the full extent of her emotional response to their near-death experience. Mike was struggling more visibly with the aftermath of their ordeal. He had difficulty sleeping and experienced flashbacks during the day that affected his concentration. Dr. Chen recommended he take temporary leave from flight operations while receiving more intensive counseling, a suggestion he initially resisted, but eventually accepted. Tony Kim seemed to be handling the trauma better than the others, but he had become noticeably more aggressive and irritable in his daily interactions. The psychologist explained that this was a common response to combat stress, and that it would likely improve with time and proper support from his fellow service members. Jenny threw herself into her work with even greater intensity, volunteering for extra shifts at the base hospital and spending her free time studying advanced medical procedures. Dr. Chen recognized this as a coping mechanism and gently encouraged her to also take time for rest and social activities with other medical personnel. The formal investigation into the incident took several weeks to complete. Military investigators interviewed not only Sarah's crew, but also the personnel at the forward operating base they had evacuated, the rescue pilots who had extracted them, and intelligence analysts who had provided the original mission briefing. Q1. Investigation's conclusions were sobering. The enemy had indeed planned an elaborate ambush, using the wounded soldiers at the forward base as bait to draw in a medical evacuation helicopter. Intelligence sources confirmed that the insurgent group responsible had been specifically targeting coalition aircraft for several months. More disturbing was the discovery that the enemy had obtained detailed information about coalition flight, routes and procedures, possibly through infiltration of local support networks or interception of radio communications. Sarah realized how fortunate they had been to survive such a well-planned and executed attack. The wounded soldiers they had evacuated all made full recoveries, thanks in large part to Jenny's excellent medical care during the crash and firefight. Sarah visited them in the hospital several times, finding their gratitude both humbling and emotionally difficult to handle. She struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why she had lived when so many others in similar situations had not. Colonel Morrison recommended Sarah and her entire crew for Valor Awards, citing their extraordinary courage and professionalism under extreme circumstances. Sarah was uncomfortable with the recognition, feeling that they had simply done their jobs as trained professionals. She worried that the attention would create unrealistic expectations for future missions. The loss of their helicopter was a significant blow to the squadron's capabilities, as replacement aircraft and crews were in high demand throughout the theater of operations. Sarah found herself temporarily assigned to administrative duties while military investigators completed their analysis of the incident, and her medical clearance was finalized. During this period of reduced flight operations, Sarah had time to reflect on her experience and its impact on her career and personal life. She began to question whether she wanted to continue flying combat missions, knowing that each flight carried the risk of facing similar or worse situations. 6 months after the crash, Sarah stood in the hangar looking at her new Black Hawk helicopter. The aircraft gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its systems upgraded with the latest defensive equipment including missile warning systems and improved armor plating. She had made the decision to return to full flight status, but the path to that moment had been longer and more difficult than she had expected. Dr. Chen had cleared her for flight operations after extensive psychological evaluation, but recommended that Sarah start with less dangerous missions to rebuild her confidence gradually. The squadron commander agreed, assigning her initially to supply runs and personnel transport flights in relatively secure areas. Sarah appreciated the consideration, though part of her worried that her colleagues might see it as a sign of weakness. Her new crew was a mix of experienced veterans and newer personnel. Co-pilot Lieutenant David Park had recently arrived from flight training and was eager to learn from someone with Sarah's combat experience. Door Gunner Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez was a seasoned professional who had specifically requested assignment to Sarah's crew after hearing about the rescue mission. The new medic, Corpsman James Taylor, was quiet and methodical in his work, very different from Jenny's more outgoing personality. Sarah found herself comparing all of her new crew members to their predecessors, which wasn't fair to anyone involved. Building new professional relationships required her to be present and engaged, not dwelling on what had been lost. Sarah's first few missions back were routine supply flights that gave her the opportunity to regain her confidence in the cockpit. She found that her technical skills had not deteriorated during her time away, but her comfort level with risk had changed significantly. She was more cautious in her decision-making, perhaps overly so, as she worked to find the right balance between safety and mission effectiveness. The squadron had implemented new procedures based on lessons learned from Sarah's crash and subsequent investigation. Flight routes were varied more frequently. Communications security had been improved, and additional intelligence resources were devoted to identifying potential ambush sites. Sarah took some satisfaction in knowing that her experience was helping to protect other crews. 3 months into her return to flight operations, Sarah received her first medical evacuation mission since the crash. The call came in during the early morning hours. 2 soldiers had been injured in an improvised explosive device attack and needed immediate transport to the base hospital. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she processed the mission details. Lieutenant Park noticed her tension as they prepared for takeoff. "Everything okay, Captain?" he asked quietly. Sarah appreciated his concern but knew she needed to project confidence for the entire crew. "Just running through the mission profile," she replied, though they both knew it was more than that. The flight to the pickup site was uneventful, but Sarah found herself constantly scanning for potential threats and second-guessing their route selection. She realized that her experience had made her more aware of dangers that had always been present, but that she had previously accepted without conscious thought. This heightened awareness was both a survival advantage and a psychological burden. The evacuation itself went smoothly, with both wounded soldiers loaded quickly and efficiently. Corpsman Taylor immediately began treating their injuries while Sarah focused on getting them back to base as rapidly as possible. The familiar routine of medical evacuation was both comforting and nerve-wracking as memories of her previous mission flooded back. During the flight back to base, one of the wounded soldiers asked Sarah if she was the pilot who had been shot down several months earlier. Word of her crew's actions had spread throughout the military community, and many personnel knew the story of their survival and rescue. Sarah confirmed her identity, but tried to redirect the conversation to the soldier's medical care. "Thank you for coming to get us," the soldier said simply. "I know it's not easy to keep flying after what happened to you." His words struck Sarah deeply, as she realized that her decision to return to flight operations was meaningful, not just to her own career, but to the soldiers who depended on medical evacuation crews for their survival. After completing the mission successfully, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment that had been missing during her administrative assignment. She had faced her fears and performed her duties professionally, despite the psychological challenges. The crew debriefing was positive, with everyone expressing confidence in their ability to work together effectively. Colonel Morrison called Sarah to his office the following week to discuss her progress and future assignments. He had been monitoring her return to flight operations carefully and was pleased with her performance. "You've shown remarkable resilience," he told her. "Your experience, both in combat and in recovery, makes you uniquely qualified to help train other crews." The colonel offered Sarah the opportunity to develop and teach a new survival course based on her experiences. The training would cover not just the technical aspects of surviving a crash in enemy territory, but also the psychological preparation needed to function effectively under extreme stress. Sarah was intrigued by the possibility of using her experience to benefit other air crews. Sarah accepted the training assignment, seeing it as a way to give meaning to her traumatic experience while continuing her flying career. She worked with Dr. Chen and other specialists to develop a comprehensive curriculum that addressed both the practical and psychological aspects of survival in combat situations. The course would become mandatory for all aircrew members in the theater of operations. The first class she taught included both experienced pilots and newer crew members. Sarah found that sharing her story in a training context was different from the debriefings and investigations she had endured immediately after the crash. She was able to focus on the lessons learned rather than reliving the trauma, which was therapeutic for her own recovery process. One of the students in her class was her brother Marcus, who had completed flight training and was deploying to the region. Teaching him the survival techniques that had saved her life created a powerful emotional connection between her personal experience and her professional responsibilities. She realized that her work was directly contributing to the safety of people she cared about most. As the months passed, Sarah continued flying missions while also developing her training program. She found that helping other air crews prepare for the dangers they might face gave her a sense of purpose that went beyond individual missions. Her experience had evolved from a source of trauma into a tool for helping others survive similar situations. The wounded soldiers from her original mission invited Sarah to attend a reunion celebration marking the first anniversary of their rescue. Seeing them healthy and surrounded by their families reminded her of why she had chosen to continue her military career, despite the risks and psychological challenges she had faced. During the reunion, one of the soldiers presented Sarah with a photograph of his newborn daughter, born several months after his evacuation. "She exists because you and your crew were willing to risk your lives for us," he said. Sarah understood then that her decision to return to flight operations and use her experience to train others was not just about personal recovery, but about the larger mission of protecting and serving others. Standing in the hangar that night, looking at her helicopter and thinking about the missions yet to come, Sarah felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for months. She had paid a price for every bullet fired at her aircraft, not in blood or treasure, but in the loss of innocence and the burden of survival, yet she had transformed that price into something valuable: wisdom, resilience, and the ability to help others face similar challenges. The nightmares still came occasionally, and she still felt a surge of anxiety before difficult missions. But Sarah had learned to manage these responses and use them to maintain the heightened awareness that might one day save her life again. She had survived not just the crash and firefight, but the more difficult battle with trauma and self-doubt that followed. Her story had become one of redemption and purpose, proving that even the most traumatic experiences could be transformed into sources of strength and service to others. As she walked toward her quarters, Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference in the lives of others who depended on her skills and experience.